October is the month for updates. I just don't even know how to. There's so much going on, Karl.
It's been
so
a busy
much going
fall.
on.
Yes, it has. Yes, it is.
Last week you were here to help us with all the updates on this non-compete with the
Right.
Federal Trade Commission.
Right.
But now you're starting to see all these changes with the Department of Labor and the wage and hour exemptions.
That's right. Yeah.
I can guarantee you that 80% of our audience has not heard any of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And in some ways, these can be even more impactful than the non-compete rules that we talked about last week. So, so the Department of Labor, some of you already know, has come out with a revised rule involving wage and hour exemptions, people who are exempt from the minimum wage and overtime rules, and how do you get qualified, how do you become exempt, what are the requirements for that exemption. And this Department of Labor rules have changed regarding the minimum level of compensation you have to receive in order to qualify for the executive, administrative, or professional exemptions, the most common exemptions to the wage and hour laws.
Well, and if we would just do a real quick recap, it was $35,000 roughly.
Mm-hmm.
And then look how big that jump was.
That's right. Effective on July 1st of this year, just a couple months ago, the professional executive and administrative exemptions minimum threshold for compensation. In other words, you had to make that amount or more in order to be exempt. That threshold went from $35,000, about $35,500 and some change, to $43,888, roughly from $684 a week to $844 a week. And that has to be, those minimum salary levels have to be met in order for the exemption to apply. What that means in effect is that some of the people who fall into that delta, that difference between the two, may no longer be exempt and will be subject to and eligible for overtime, whereas before they might not have been. So, which of course is the intent of the rule, right? To get more and more people below that threshold so that they can be paid overtime for hours worked in excess of 40 in any work week.
Well, and again, we saw it coming because, it took almost a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
They just drug us on. And there was even rumor that it was going to go up to 60,000. And most of the team has, most of our viewers have heard us talk about that new threshold, but help us understand the challenges that are happening now.
Well, a lot of it has to do with, how do you plan for that change in classification? You've got people who are administratively or exempt administratively, professionally, or from an executive standpoint, who are not eligible for overtime. They may work for 40, 50 hours a week, and that's pretty common, particularly in that mid-level, early, low-level manager. Mm-hmm. A lot of organizations who have working for people who are exercising some management responsibility may be exempt, but they're not highly compensated people. So they fit just above that old threshold and therefore satisfy the exemption requirements. Now they may not. And so those folks who are typically working 40, 50 hours might now be eligible for overtime, whereas they weren't before. And from an employer standpoint, of course, that becomes potentially a budgeting issue, a cash flow question. There are a lot of financial ramifications to that for obvious reasons. I mean, it could be a real advantage for some employees who are in that kind of middle ground, that just above the threshold or just below the threshold now for exemptions. So it is a hugely important development, and the change that occurred in July 1 is not the end of it. There's another change that is due to happen on January 1st of 2025. And you talked about the $60,000 threshold being potentially the next step. Well, it's about right. If the rule stays in effect, those thresholds change again, effective on January 1st of 2025. In this case, they'll go up to a minimum of $58,656 annually. So about a little over $1,100 a week will be the minimum threshold for exemption purposes. So you have to make that or above in order to be exempt. Even if you do all the other management stuff, even if you do all the other exempt duties, if you're not making that amount, you're still eligible for overtime.
And then thank you for saying that, because again, we want to emphasize that the rest of it isn't changing.
Mm-hmm.
So you could have an accountant, and if they're not making that threshold, even though their expertise and knowledge was gained from a higher institution. So what I want to do today is dig a little deeper, because what I'm hearing now is that we've got employers that are looking at these individuals and going, well, okay, I've got somebody that's being paid $26 an hour. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's falling. It will fall under that new threshold here in January 1.
Good.
And they're looking at that hourly rate. Well, that hourly rate is, that, and then double that for overtime, and a time and a half.
Time and a half, yeah.
For a time and a half for overtime.
Yeah.
So they want to really control the hours, and they want to start pulling in, help our viewers understand what limitations an employer are under. Okay, if what can you and can't do to control that budget.
Right. Well, great question. That is the fundamental challenge, and employers are allowed to regulate work hours, right? They're allowed to say, you are authorized to work 40 hours a work week and not a minute more. And if you do that without authorization, you can be subject to disciplinary action, including potentially discharge. So you have the ability as an employer to regulate the hours of work. But if someone is working more than 40 hours in any work week, exceeds that 40-hour threshold with the knowledge and acquiescence of the employer, even without the direct authorization, but knowledge and acquiescence is enough, they're entitled to overtime at time and a half for those hours worked. So the question is, how do you regulate that? How do you prevent an employee from working more hours than... And many employees want to do that because they want to get jobs done, they want to get work completed. You get good workers, you get people who are dedicated and conscientious. Sometimes they'll work, and you know what? Sometimes they might not even put their time down.
And if they had the exempt mindset of nobody's counting my hours, I'm just going to come in and do my job, why would they?
Yeah. But if you're non-exempt now, all of a sudden, you have to track your hours. You have to track them accurately. And, the challenge is that even if you don't necessarily record your hours correctly, you could still be eligible for overtime if you've provided work with the knowledge and or acquiescence of the employer. So the old 30s era term is suffered or permitted to work, right? So I didn't direct you to work 44 hours that week, but I kind of knew you were doing it anyway, and I allowed it to happen. Well, that's compensable time, and it's subject to those 4 hours, subject to overtime. You can prohibit that. You can discipline if somebody exceeds authority or violates the rules. You can do all that. But in some cases, you might even still have to pay them on their way out the door.
Another very interesting question that came in, and believe it or not, this was a national retailer with a lot of locations. Let's just say that. But the question was, look, we've got all these assistant managers, retail, right? Mm-hmm. And these assistant managers are required to open and close so many nights a week. And, we need them to be setting the floors, working the planograms. So on average, they're working 50, 55 hours a week.
Yeah.
But they're all under that $58,000 threshold, right? So January 1. And so the question came in is, can they renegotiate those rates so that they don't have to pay overtime? And can they restructure some of the job titles so that individuals who closed as of December 1st will no longer be closing January 1st because they don't want them working all those hours?
Yeah. Well, interesting set of questions there. Question number one, I think, and this comes up a lot in my practice, can we cut a deal with our employee to make it make overtime optional or withdraw overtime under certain circumstances? The short answer to that is no, you can't. You can't waive minimum wage and overtime requirements. You can't, by agreement, even if I'm a well-intentioned employee and I really want to do a favor and I really love my job and I'm willing to take a pay cut, but and willing to enter into sign whatever my employer gives me, that agreement to waive my right to overtime compensation will not be enforceable. The Department of Labor will not enforce that, and in fact will require the employer to cut a check for the overtime regardless of that deal. So short answer is that one doesn't work. Can you restructure job responsibilities? Are there ways to structure a position that'll make it exempt? Well, again, you still have to get above that wage threshold, right? That's really the crux of it. And a lot of employers are looking at this. They're saying, well, okay, I can do one of two things. I can keep this person as a non-exempt middle manager where I have to pay them overtime for all these extra hours, or I can bump their salary up to $59,000 a year. All their duties are already managerial in nature, so they qualify under the duties test, and they're now just above that minimum compensation threshold, so they technically be exempt. Which one is the more cost-effective solution for the employer is the real question from their perspective. And, from the employee's perspective, a lot of employees like being exempt. They like how that feels.
Isn't that amazing?
They like how that feels.
Absolutely fascinates me. If you and I could get overtime,
Yeah.
holy shnikes, my life would change.
Yeah, that's right.
This whole ego thing around not clocking in and being exempt just baffles me.
Yeah. Well, it is a kind of prestige thing, and I get that. We all want to seek advancement. We all want to have a position where we can be proud of our advancement, proud of our authority, proud of the things that we've accomplished. And traditionally, one of the ways that we've marked our advancement through an organization is going from that hourly position to a now exempt managerial position that feels different, that feels important, that, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's a valuable thing for some folks. So,
but it doesn't pay the car payment, and it doesn't pay the rent.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
You might actually be making more money if you were taking the overtime, right?
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. I just don't understand.
Yeah. But again, I for a lot of folks, money isn't the primary motivator, and I think that's one of the essential lessons we learn in HR. I know you know it as well as anybody in your field. Money is a motivator, but it's not always the most important one, and sometimes not even a motivator at all. There are many other things in an employment world that motivate people: culture, advancement, opportunity, all those soft things that we don't always think about are in the real world sometimes more important to people than the actual paycheck.
It just dawned on me. I know you've been in a mediation where we've been able to offer some of those softer things in when they think they're going to walk out with $1 million, and then, but what if we gave you, or what if they agreed or negotiated? And they
sometimes,
many times will come to a compromise off that money.
Sometimes.
You're absolutely right.
Sometimes it happens, yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So again, these are ways of, I think, thinking differently about that difference. But yeah, I mean, I think as the compensation thresholds increase, and they will increase regardless of what happens in the courts, eventually we'll see higher compensation thresholds. Thinking about alternatives and options still within the framework of the law, but there are other choices for employers and employees to make that are legal, that work, and that might really serve the purpose of both parties.
So the answer to that is yes, you can renegotiate the terms of employment with your current staff if you feel that it's in the best interest of the company, and it might be in the best interest of the employee as well. And you need to be doing that early, because right now in October, you only have a matter of weeks, if you really think about it, till this new threshold steps in. Mm-hmm. And it may take you weeks to get your entire organization on board with what changes you have to make.
Right.
So, and please, 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 either contact your HR consultant or contact your labor law attorney and run it by them. Say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of, and this is why. Always have the why, but make sure that it is going to keep you compliant. Now, in your example of moving that person up to $59,000, that would be a quick fix for a short period.
It would, yeah.
Because within, the next year or two?
Well, again, in 2027, if this rule survives, and that's the other thing we need to mention, it's subject to court challenge. We're going to know by the end of the year whether these automatic adjustments will survive going forward. But if those automatic adjustments do occur, they stay in the law, we'll have another adjustment probably in 2027. So, staying ahead of that curve is not going to be easy.
Yeah.
It's going to be a financial challenge for most companies, most employers, and a managerial challenge too, because you're always sort of bumping up against that classification problem. So you'll have to watch that very closely. But again, we will know probably before the end of the year whether the courts are going to put this ongoing adjustment mechanism on hold, and we'll stay tuned. Probably come back and do another program on that maybe at the end of the year.
I'm sorry. What did you just say? Probably.
Okay.
Who are you? Karl Ulrich with Sebaly, Shillito and Dyer. Who is he? Basically, he's my lifelong partner when it comes to this podcast and this show here at the Human Resource. Please stay with us. See us next week. We've got another great topic for you. Take care.